Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's Pumla's evening, so she's going to do most of the talking, and I'm going to just prompt her some directions. Yeah? She's just, as you heard, come back from Switzerland, where she had to deal with quite difficult situations, as I think is your way, with trauma. And I'm going to put some more stress on you immediately and jump right in. To tell everybody a little bit about the book. It's a collection of articles, reflections that Phumla has written over the last, I think the earliest is about 93, am I right? I think it's around about 1993.
Yeah, well, I thought it was 10 years, but
it's almost 20 years. It's almost 20 years of reflections. And what I find particularly striking about them is that Phumla writes in a way that is very, very balanced, very measured, objective. The issues are thought through very thoroughly. And so I had a feeling that they hadn't dated much. They hadn't dated, actually. Although, of course, they're allied to particular moments at that time. And I suppose the first question I would want to say is, when you were making that selection, did you look at past reflections and think, oh, I don't really think this way anymore? I detected there was a movement when you read through the essays. So are there some things here that you excluded completely because you thought they were dated, and are there things that you included where you've changed your mind a little bit?
Thank you, Brent, and good evening, everyone. It is on. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I have not changed my mind about any of the stuff I wrote. I would say the same thing again about all of the issues that I dealt with. Exclusions, I suppose, I could have had a thicker book, but Tafelberg didn't want a thicker book.
I would be quite if it was longer.
Yeah.
Okay. So the book runs through a range of sort of six sections, principally. The first one is remembrance and reconciliation, and I think that the focus was very often there, as a former commissioner on the TRC, was revenge and forgiveness and breaking the cycle of violence. I think underlies those, collects those essays together. Then the dilemmas of leadership and morality, which I think I could sum up as bankrupt leadership. Moving into the seeds of discontent, which was issues around inequality, race, racism and affirmative action. And then women and male power, basically the continued denigration and devaluation of women in our society. And I thought, why have you ended the book on this section? And then it occurred to me that perhaps one only understands the position of women if one actually has a look at all those previous issues, how women were treated in the past, how they were treated under apartheid, issues around race, inequality, and leadership. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit for us on how you see the position of women.
I have to thank my editor, Kristen, for organizing the book in that way. I had organized it chronologically, and she thought that was boring. So she found a much more interesting way of organizing the book. On the issue of women, this is a very important issue in our country. We have, as a president in our country who often doesn't seem to recognize the importance of sending messages about the respect for women, in a country where rape is a crisis, is a problem, and domestic violence and all those issues. We don't get a very clear message from not just the president, from in general leadership, political leadership. We don't get that voice, or a clear voice of, condemning or taking a stance, a position, where they show in the way that they relate to issues of gender, particularly violence against women, a degree of, of outrage, you know, of even performative outrage, just to send a message that we at the top want you out there to know that this is not acceptable. Instead, we get, you know, we find that there are stories of some of the leaders in politics themselves engaging in questionable behavior, which demonstrate this disrespect that one sees in the homes of many people or in the communities where violence against women is so rife. And that is the same thing we can say about everything else, you know, about leadership. If there isn't a clear moral tone from the top, then, which is really actually what my book is about. It's a response to the lack of moral reflection among leaders in our country. Most of what I write about, in fact I would say almost all of what I write about, has to do with this cry of where is moral reflection. And if we don't see it at the level of top leadership, we shouldn't be surprised, you know, by some of the behaviors and some of the reports that we see of violence, even by young children, you know, young boys. It's just astounding how little thought, you know, there is about what is our position as leaders. You know, just the idea of, you know, what message should we send as leaders about certain issues. There just doesn't seem to be any reflection. And so the issue of women is also, you know, falls in that kind of, you know, genre of just absence of moral reflection.
But when you say leadership, I think I have a vision in my mind when you say top leadership, and I know exactly what he looks like. But I also think isn't there also a problem with female leadership in this country? And you describe this one scene, which I think is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the book. There are many. Of the Women's League, who have invited, the ANC Women's League, who've invited Jacob Zuma to come and address them. And they pull out candles, and there's like this candle vigil awaiting the president, and they're all infantilized and told, be quiet, you know, shh, you know, the president's coming. When he enters, it must be absolute silence, like it's a surprise birthday party on Women's Day for Zuma. So what is going on with the Women's League? What is going on with, why are they letting the side down so badly? And again there's this opportunism happening amongst female leadership.
You know, in the olden days, by which I mean during the struggle days, there was this notion that as a black woman, you cannot stand up for issues of, you know, women's rights, because there is the bigger struggle, the struggle, you know, for freedom and the struggle against apartheid. That's the bigger struggle. You can't then challenge our men, you know, when it comes to these other problems. So I see that as something that has not changed, even with the leaders, with the women in political leadership, that there seems to be a fear. They're overwhelmed by fear. They cannot speak out, although they're in these powerful positions. They just cannot speak out about issues of importance in our country, and it's very disappointing. You know, a few months ago, in April, I was in Rwanda, and I was so moved by the real power that women had in Rwanda. Okay, Rwanda is complicated, but I have to say this about Rwanda, that there's something about this clarity, this moral clarity. Forget for a moment what we think about the president there, but there is this moral clarity in the way that, you know, the president speaks in Rwanda in public, the way that he honors women, the way that the women themselves stand up, and when they speak, you can see they're speaking from a position of power, and the kinds of things that they say. I mean, these are women who when they joined parliament, they're not taken seriously by some of the men, and then the men realized that these women mean business, and then they started wanting to join. I was there with my student who supervising. She was looking. We're looking at this question actually of you know, what is the difference between, you know, notions of power within women's power in parliament in Rwanda and in South Africa. And she was interviewing women in parliament in Rwanda. And it was just so heartwarming, you know, so refreshing to see women really having a serious presence within society. We don't see that here, you know. And in fact, when we look at when I think about women in some of the public appearances they've had, you know, there's something that is uninspiring. You know, there's something that is kind of, you know, cold and warm, and not even cold, perhaps warm. I think cold might be better. There is something warm and uninspiring. There's just no drive, no sense of, we are here to make a change. There isn't that voice at all. I saw that in Rwanda. I saw that in Rwanda very much. Here, I mean, going back to the issue of, to this example, this story that you are referring to, it was in Bloemfontein at the university, my university in Free State, and Women's League, Women's Day. The day is a celebration of one of the most highly regarded women in South Africa in the women's struggle. And actually, Zuma was going to be the speaker. But because, I can't remember what year it is, but I think there were so many issues. It was close to elections, there was tension, you know, in Free State, you know, all of the stuff that goes on within the ANC. And so they needed Zuma, or Zuma needed to be seen. There was Julius Malema was just emerging. So he needed to make a statement. And they bumped off because it's Zuma. Can you believe that? I mean, on Women's Day. And not only that, the way that this was very revealing actually that evening. And I realized that one of the things that's going on is a fear of the president. It really was so, it was palpable. There was a fear of the president in the way that everyone was so running around. I mean, we should not be afraid of our leaders. We should respect our leaders. There was a fear of the president. And it was present everywhere, you know, especially among the women who are organizing that event. And that is dangerous, I think, because then you can't, if you're afraid of a leader, then you can't question the leader. And that is part of the problem. The other interesting thing about that evening, of course, is the fear of the president himself, because there were all these armed police, you know, parading around. It was bizarre. It looked like, you know, some state in, you know, one of those backwards, you know, military states. You know, there were just all these, you know, men, and the way that the young people were co-opted to provide the kind of military presence, it was really frightening. It was very troubling to see that, and that's why I wrote that. I was sitting in front, and so it was kind of in my face. And I was very, very troubled by what I witnessed.
Yes, well, our blue light brigades and bodyguards, and I mean, the security cluster seems to have gone quite crazy. I mean, at the opening of Parliament, it gets worse every year. Now they chop out the whole canopy of the trees down Government Avenue. And I was told, I asked questions, no, so that snipers can get a clear line if anybody wants to attempt something against the president. You mentioned Rwanda, and also you've just flown in from Switzerland, and also what's clear in the book is how widely you are published, which is very nice. But then also going to so many conflict zones in so many places. And I think at one point you could go very proudly, coming from what we had accomplished here in our transition peacefully. And we could export this model of the TRC to some extent. We could actually, you know, be an example. But I'm not sure what we're an example of now to the world. Are reactions changing to you when you go to these places? Has it changed in the last 10 years?
It has. I told a friend of mine recently that I feel when I travel now, I feel the way that white South Africans were opposed to apartheid felt when they traveled abroad. That's how I feel, you know. And there is this level of, you know, dehumanization of citizens in the way that things are handled. You know, one feels a sense of not being, you know, of being ignored, not being taken seriously. You know, when for instance, we get excited by the public protector's findings and her reports and her grace and her thoroughness. We are so excited, we read about what she said and we get so excited. And then the response is like, okay, we've heard, you know, let's move on. There's like nothing. So while there are these really great and wonderful institutions of democracy in our country, if they're not effective, if they're not, you know, if the response to them is just simply to brush them aside, so what is the value of having those? So I do, you know, when I travel, and when I'm going to speak in public, I can almost anticipate the questions, you know, some of the questions by some, you know, bold members of the audience, you know, who, you know, ask about now the government, the black government is in power, you know, they will start, you know, with those kinds of statements. So it is diminishing, you feel diminished, you know, and when I think about when I returned in 1994, I happened to have been in the US when we voted for the first time, and I voted in Boston. And returning home, you know, you know, I felt it was so emotional because I was returning for the first time to my country as a South African. I had previously never been able to say I am a South African. I would say I come from South Africa, and I'd actually never actually reflected on that statement. I just always said I come from South Africa. But when I realized that I am a South African now, you know, I voted, I was a South African, you know, it was so moving and emotional for me. So part of the reaction with all of this stuff is a deep, deep sense of disappointment. You know, that our hopes were high, and I mean, I have to say, I know that some friends of mine and colleagues and many of you here, you felt the same way, many of you. But as a black person, you know, having come from an era where I wasn't recognized in South Africa as a citizen, and in fact, I tell the story, you know, sometimes, that I grew up in Langa Township. And even though Langa, you can see the Table Mountain from Langa, I never actually saw it. It was just not present for me in my world. It was not part of my repertoire of, you know, life's experience because I was excluded from it. I mean, that's now the explanation that I can give now. But then, you know, I just didn't see Table Mountain. And even when I went to the US for the first time, and people would rave about Cape Town and about Sea Point, you know, and I remember I was doing a workshop at a center, in a retreat center in Santa Barbara. And these people, you know, who were at a group of about 18 people, they kept on talking to me about how Santa Barbara is so similar to Sea Point. Don't I think, you know, what do I think, and so on. And I was like, I don't know, you know, and here I am, you know, coming from Cape Town. I mean, I came from Langa. So now returning in '94, you know, having voted and feeling a real sense of belonging to my country, it was very, very emotional for me. And so now when and then, of course, as you say, and some of the articles that I wrote in Boston, in the Boston Globe, in the New York Times, in the LA Times, with Washington Post, they were heady days of excitement. Something new was happening. I went to a church in Cambridge, because I lived in Cambridge, to an Anglican church, the Episcopal church in the US. It's called the Episcopal Church. And so I remember when I was invited, one of the weeks on a Sunday, the sermon was around the text, the Old Testament text, "Behold, I do a new thing." And so I thought, that's a good way of titling my paper, my talk. And so I wrote this, "Behold, I do a new thing," and then there was a subtitle referring to the Truth Commission. So these were exciting days of excitement. And South Africa was really, I mean, part of the reason, you know, our story still endures is that some people just, you know, they know what's going on, but they're still holding on to that good story. And yet now there's actually a bad story to tell. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the essays, I think, where you're putting your finger on what's going wrong, and quite prophetically, you write about how the black middle class, will be turned upon, basically, if there isn't more equality in the country. And maybe we could ask you just to tell us a little bit more about that view, because I have a follow-up question to that as well. But is that where things are going wrong? That we have an elite pact that's formed?
Do you know where that is? I just have that paragraph. Maybe if you can find it. This was in 2000, and Thabo Mbeki, Pepper Green, and Alan, her husband, were in Cambridge at Harvard, and we were invited to speak with Pepper on national radio, and the question was, who is Thabo Mbeki? And I remember Pepper and I feeling a little irritated. Why are they asking this question? So
I think there's more than one paragraph where you address this, but perhaps this is the one at the bottom of page 120 and the top of 120. To see if that is the area you're thinking of.
Maybe I think it's in more at the beginning. Anyway, let me tell you, it's something about, it's just a statement about, if something, Thabo Mbeki came into his presidency, and one of the things he was concerned about, or rather one of his mission, was to create a black middle class. And so we just had that conversation on NPR, National Public Radio, with Pepper, and I reflected on this. This came up in the conversation about what Thabo Mbeki's mission was, and I remember thinking at the time that he is going beyond reconciliation. He's a man who is going to bring about real change, because he was kind of the real transformation man. And so there was some excitement when he came, he took over the presidency. And so after some time, I started reflecting about what does this, creation of focusing on the black middle class mean? And what about, other processes like improving the schools, our health system, what is going to happen to that? And so in that article I wrote, my reflection was that if nothing happens, it's well and good to create a black middle class, but if nothing happens, no change happens at the level of the poorest of the poor, at the level of the people, the majority of our people in our country, if nothing changes for them, if no change happens, then what I said is that then they will rise up against the black middle class. They will not rise up against whites, but they will rise up against the black middle class. And that was the statement in 2000. And so in my work over the years, I have been involved in, Guguletu, in Khayelitsha, as a mentor for counselors, HIV/AIDS counselors, and several other involvements, that take me to different parts of the communities that I grew up, that I'm familiar with. And so it's painful to watch the level of depravity in this community. Now, I'm going to say something, but I'm going to quickly say something else so that it doesn't stand on its own. And the something that I want to say is things have become worse in the township. They have become worse. However, I think we also have to remember that in the olden days, black people were prevented from coming into the urban areas. They could not come. They had to have passbooks and so on. There was influx control. But now the gates have been opened. People have come in their great numbers. There was no thinking, and this is what is frustrating about leadership, is that why wasn't there imaginative thinking about, all these policies that are changing, that are scrapped, something is going to shift, then we have to make, provision for this and that. There was just completely no thinking about it. And there continues to be no thinking about it, total absence of any, imaginative reflection on what needs to be done. I mean, that statement of what needs to be done has now become the statement of the EFF, what is to be done. But that's what should have been asked then, what is to be done, because now we are, all these changes, all these laws are being scrapped, and people are coming to the cities because of the promise of work, because the land is dried, out in the rural areas. There's no longer the reliance on land. They're coming to the cities and urban areas, and the tragedy that is happening is that, increasingly, almost, from the time that I left Cape Town, when I used to go and do some work in Khayelitsha, which is about 3 years ago, probably 4 years ago, to now, when I had to go back at the invitation of a group of lawyers who were working on the Khayelitsha Commission because of the violence there. I was really frightened to see, frightened, I use that word deliberately. It frightens one when you see that this beautiful country with all its hopes and all, what people were hoping, for. Now, we are talking about the second generation. This is what is painful. This is the second generation. It's not my generation who lived through apartheid. It is our children. These are 20-year-old and 25-year-olds. And what is their hope? The young children, you see the little ones running around, and then you look at the schools, and then you really just wonder, where is something going to shift and change? So I think that really is a question. And what is our responsibility? Where is something going to change? And what is our responsibility about at least beginning to engage about this question of, we come together, we talk about these things. What should we do? What should we do? There's a sense also sometimes among us of helplessness. It's all well and good to write and so on, but then we read to each other what we think. And so there's something, another level.
You are doing things on another level. You are actually going to, for instance, I think you're referring to the commission into policing in Khayelitsha. And a lot of the testimony there was, I co-edit Ground Up, which is a news organisation. We based basically out of Khayelitsha, Gugulethu and Langa, and we followed it. We had reporters every single day, and we were the only news network, I think, that actually followed it on a daily basis and wrote about it with analysis. And some of that testimony was really hair-raising from schoolgirls and from kids, and that's just down the road here.
I have to say also that there are areas in Khayelitsha where people live with dignity, but there are areas also, and that it's so stark, it kind of, confronts you, so powerfully that sometimes you are immobilized. You can't believe that in 2014, this is how people live still.
And I think that's the shift that I see in the work. If I look at your earlier essays and that, you are writing with this, I think one of the reasons why they haven't dated is because you're always looking forward. So you're looking towards building the future. Even in your more recent things, you're looking towards, what is to be done, where are we headed? And I think that helps a lot. But the early essays, I can see there's this enormous optimism. And there's a feeling that through the TRC and through having some process of reconciliation, of the truth setting us free, of forgiveness, we'll be redeemed and we'll break these cycles. And then I think as you look at the later essays, there's a sort of a realization that we can have all the symbolic reconciliation, we can have all the public theatre we want in the world, but unless we actually have real change on the ground, all of that can come to naught.
Absolutely.
And And now because you're a former TRC commissioner, you see, I can also confess to you, 'cause I feel I'm in very safe hands. And I have to confess that for the first 57 pages of this book, I was having a raging battle with you, because I'm strongly of the view that Eugene de Kock should not be allowed out, and he must stay exactly where he is. But I want to link that to your previous book, where you really focused on that. And where do you see now the TRC process and all that we accomplished in those years? How are we going to continue that or redeem that? Because I think it is in serious danger now. I think it is.
I have to think about this. My answer. This question is asked. I get asked all the time, but I don't have a stock answer.
There are no answers, but we can.
But you know what was really wonderful about the Truth Commission is that it actually showed that we can come together. I know this. I mean, sometimes when I speak about this, I relate. I draw from actual experience of seeing people change almost moment by moment. As the history unfolds, people are changing. It was an amazing moment for our country. Something did shift. It did bring us together, you know, in a real sense. There was conversation, you know. There were, of course, there was opposition and so on, but there was something about we're gathering around these halls, you know, and talking about our past. There was a problem, of course, at the beginning that most white people thought that this was an attack on whiteness, that this was kind of, you know, a payback, you know, because we first had survivors and victims of apartheid atrocities. And there was a kind of reluctance among many white people, or some white people, that this is not for them, so to speak. But as time went on, there was a sense of embrace of the process, that this is about us as South Africans. So that process was important to take us, to just move us, you know, from the place of pain into a place of not denying the pain, but of saying, we can deal with it. We can move forward and work with it. So now there are real issues now that we just talked about. You know, some people say, "Oh, we had the TRC, so let's forget about the past." I don't think we can forget about the past. Now there is greater urgency for us to have not talk about the past in order to judge, but to talk about the past in order to reflect on what's missing in our democracy. You know, what's missing in our democracy? We had a successful story of transition. Something is not sitting right. So if we can begin to have public conversation, to say that this is what's happening, you know, to Themba, this is his life, you know, this is what he does every day, and this is what happens to him, and this is what happens to Nomsa, you know, so that we can have this, and Nomsa's mother, you know, was forcibly removed from this and the other community, or she had a house bulldozed in Crossroads during the SADF and vigilante violence in South Africa. And we bring that story into dialogue with the story of Anne-Marie, you know, McGregor in Paarl, whose son, you know, was killed by a mortar bomb in Namibia. She sent her son away, you know, to fight the so-called border wars. To put these stories, you know, into dialogue with one another, and so that, you know, there isn't a sense